Perfect. And Bruce, if our fourth analyst doesn't show up, you guys at the next.
She's ready to go.
So we're ready to go. So the next, I'll just knock on the thing when you guys are. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with the next panel here. So if everybody could please take their seats. All right, one more time, if everybody could please take their seats now. We're about to start our next panel. That would be appreciated. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the Cannabis Legal Barometer panel. We're going to be just talking about things from a federal and local and state policy level and how banking and these laws have been affecting the industry and how it affects consumers and businesses. My name is Brian Bergman. I am a partner and attorney at Nolan Hyman here in Los Angeles. I've been working with cannabis businesses for quite some time now, since prior to Prop 64 passing. And we work on things that go from everything from the business and deal making to regulatory compliance and licensing, as well as different contracts and intellectual property branding and entertainment and location-based services and branding for businesses. I'm excited to be joined by these other very esteemed individuals with me today, including all the way from my left, Bruce Margolin, who is one of the oldest warriors in the business here. He has been practicing since 1967. He's probably won more marijuana defenses than anyone else in the country. He is the director of the LA Normal chapter. He was the prior chairman of ethics for the NACDL, and he's been lauded by the ACLU and even ran for governor and Congress on a cannabis-based platform in the past. So we're very excited to have him up here with us. And also to my left is Jack Thompson. He is a lobbyist. He works with Congress and Senate, as well as the DEA, FDA, and FBI for different cannabis industry issues, as well as other nonprofit and other concerns for different consulting businesses. He's been doing this for over 20 years. He recently formed a new policy group to work with cannabis banking and other issues that are facing the industry, and he has been greatly involved with trying to get some banking reform at a federal level, which would be something we all need. And lastly, to my left is Jackie Rocco, who comes to us from West Hollywood. She is the Director of Public Works and Code Compliance for the cannabis businesses in West Hollywood, which is one of the more progressive cities in our state, and is definitely working to do things which many of the other states are not, including, I think, is the only city so far to allow for public consumption in their lounges and the like. So it's very exciting to see and hear a little bit of getting that curtain drawn back in a little bit later today. So I figured we'd just start the panel just briefly discussing and giving a quick overview that unfortunately cannabis is still considered a federal controlled substance, Schedule 1, and what that means is that under the Controlled Substances Act is that it's basically still federally illegal to be involved in any sort of sale or distribution or other commercial practices revolving around cannabis. That being said, there's plenty of state laws out there, as you've seen, and state law, as long as you're working within your own state's borders, does not get preempted by federal law. It only becomes an issue if you start crossing state lines. And so because of that, there's been a wave of legalization over the last 20 years or so. And back in 2013, the federal government under the Obama administration provided a lot of federal guidelines that was able to help us. They weren't rules or laws, but they gave the states and businesses an opportunity to understand what federal enforcement priorities were. And as long as you didn't really fall afoul of those, more likely than not, due to limited resources, the federal government wouldn't necessarily come knocking on your door. And the things that they were concerned about were things like public health and safety, having undisclosed funds being laundered over to organized crime, diversion to youths and minors, using it on federal land and things of that nature. And so because it's still federally illegal, even though states have been able to come up with good regulatory schemes, including here in California, what it's done is it's created a real patchwork of laws and regulations. It's very MC Escher-like. In one perspective, we have the federal laws that say it's still illegal, and because of that, you can't really get bankruptcy protection. There's no directives from the EPA or anything on pesticide use or other public health safeties, issues like that. There's a lack of control still. You can't get trademark protections or things of that nature yet because it's still federally illegal. But there's also been some reforms that have been coming down the pike and things that are trying to be done. And I wanted to start today's panel with Mr. Thompson, who has been working at the federal level, to talk with us about what's been trying to be done with banking and otherwise in the industry as we try to seek that reform.
Thanks, Brian. There we go. Thanks, Brian. As he said, my name is Jack Jacobson. I'm an advisor at Thompson Coburn, which is a national law firm here. I've been working as a federal lobbyist for about 20 years. I started out in the energy space, but about 6 years ago got drawn into cannabis policy when the city and county of Denver, Colorado became one of my clients. And that was fascinating. That was my first entree into cannabis policy, and I think you could count on two hands the number of lobbyists in DC who are actively working on cannabis policy at the federal level. So it's been really fascinating, and as Brian said, over the past year or so, I've really refined my focus to really work on cannabis banking reform. And we all know the problem there is because it's still because cannabis is still a Schedule I controlled substance. Know your customer and anti-money laundering laws preclude most cannabis businesses from being able to utilize the federally insured banking system. So that's regular banks and credit unions. This means that only about a third of cannabis businesses have a traditional bank or credit union that they're working with, which means about 2/3 of cannabis businesses operate on an all-cash basis. This leads to public safety issues. It leads to a barrier to entry to the market for folks that don't have large amounts of cash to invest in these businesses. And from the patient side, it means that you have to pay for medicine with cash, which is sometimes a real burden if you're coming to the end of your paycheck and you need to get your medicine, but you can't float for a couple of days on a credit card. That can be a real problem for some folks, and it's a problem that we need to address, and Washington's been working on that. You know the landscape in DC right now. It's hyper-partisan, very contentious. What you probably don't know is that work is still getting done, and that's really important. In addition to the regular appropriations work, there is a bill specifically on cannabis that is moving through the U.S. Congress, and it's moving at a pretty good pace. In Congress, there are multiple committees that are currently working on cannabis policy. Veterans Affairs is working on veterans access. Small business is trying to figure out a way for small businesses to get SBA loans and other support from the Small Business Administration. Appropriations, which is government funding, they usually have little riders on the bills, and there are 3 currently active in the cannabis space. One of them deals with the federal government not interfering in medical cannabis programs. Another rider seeks to continue to prohibit DC from implementing a regulatory regime for cannabis products, which means we only have a black market, which I do not really like. The banking and financial services committees have been very aggressive at moving forward on cannabis legislation. The thing with legislators in Washington is on an issue that's contentious like cannabis, they don't want to just dive in the pool. They want to sort of dip their toe in the water. And so it's been a real struggle to move standalone cannabis legislation forward. The piece that has been moving is the SAFE Banking Act. The SAFE Banking Act is a pretty technical bill, but basically what it does is it would prohibit federal agencies from interfering with legitimate cannabis transactions in states where there's a legal regulatory regime. Which means in California, if I go to a shop and purchase cannabis for my own personal needs and that shop is a legitimate business, that transaction would be legal. If I went to the schoolyard and bought cannabis from someone who's peddling out of their backpack, that's an illegal purchase, and the federal government would still be able to take action against that sort of transaction. The Safe Banking Act has moved at real breakneck speed. In this year was the 6th year the bill was introduced, and this year they had a hearing in Financial Services in February. In March, they marked up the bill, and in September, they voted on the bill on the House floor under a special circumstance which they anticipated an overwhelming vote, and that held to be true. The vote was 321 to 103, so it was over a 3-to-1 margin, including a lot of Republicans. Only one Democrat voted against the bill, and that's because of the circumstances in Alabama of the cannabis laws and her feeling that equity needed to come first when the laws in Alabama were so severe for even minor cannabis possessions. So there is a lot of political maneuvering going on with the bill. The bill doesn't only protect businesses and the financial institutions they work for, but the bill would also extend those protections to ancillary businesses. If you've got solar panels, you could a cannabis company could do financial transaction with that solar company, or the payroll company, or HR, or the IT company that the cannabis company is working with. Even right now, technically, a cannabis company shouldn't be able to pay their garbage bill unless they're banked, unless they're paying cash. So those are the types of solutions that this bill extends protections to, and that also includes insurance protections. The insurance lobby got in pretty late in the game, but was able to get some corrections in the bill to extend the business protections to cover insurance as well. There is a big tension in Washington right now between, the cannabis companies that really want to be able to bank their funds and the activist community that is really focused on the expungement issue, the setting aside of convictions, and the decriminalization. And you see a lot of push and pull there, but as we saw in the House, Democrats are pretty unified that this is an issue. Banking access is an issue that really does hit minority communities and folks that have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs. And we were really happy that the Minority Cannabis Business Association and patient advocacy groups and unions were all with us in working at moving this legislation forward. The outlook in the Senate is a little more muddled. The chairman of the Senate Banking Committee is a guy named Senator Richard Crapo. He's from Idaho, and Idaho has no legalization, not even for CBD or hemp. They just don't have any. So he's got a real problem with his constituents in that he's got to be responsive to the voters he was elected by, but he also wants to move this bill forward in a responsible manner. He is expected within the next, 6 to 8 weeks to put out his own version of a banking reform bill. What he wants to do is add some additional guide rails to that, which means he wants to be sure that there aren't additional problems created with the bill, that the House bill is as buttoned up as possible, and that we can still make sure that the federal government can take action against illegal or poor operators. So he's really working on that. Another big question on the Senate bill is if that bill will grant access to U.S. capital markets. As we saw in Canada, access to those Canadian financial markets freed up a lot of capital. It's an imperfect system, though, and there are more and more companies and financial institutions and activists that are really working at highlighting the need for cannabis companies in the United States to have access to capital markets. That's a question right now, but it's something that we're really keeping an eye on.
That's great, Jack. Thank you very much. And it's very important to note that it's not as if the federal government doesn't want these businesses to use banks. It's more an issue of the Because it's federally illegal, the banks are the ones that are being given the burden right now to have to do the auditing and the legwork and have the responsibility of ensuring that certain steps are met, which when you put them all together, it's just too onerous for the banks to do. They love taking our money, but they don't necessarily like to spend that money. So because of that, it's definitely a very important domino in federal change and reform for this industry, is seeing what banking will bring. And hopefully with that as a first step, we'll start to see some other issues start to open up as well, including the repeal of 280E, which is a very onerous tax statute, at least as it applies to cannabis state legal businesses, not necessarily as a whole. And it also would lead to other issues that we're seeing as well, where there's immigration issues for many businesses and people who are having issues getting citizenship or coming in and out of the country, because of the fact that they are involved in the sale or distribution of a controlled substance. And so Canadian citizens especially have been noticing that issue and felt that pain recently if they just answer that question truthfully. And so it's good to see that there is a lot of movement, and banking is hopefully what will be the first in many changes, because banking leads to safety. You're able to follow the money better, you're able to know what should be taxed, you're able to make sure that money is safe, it leads to less crime, and it'll also lead to better ways for every other businesses to work together, because most businesses don't like to accept cash payments because it's harder to track. So that's why federal government and every reforms that are necessary makes things seem a little bit difficult to follow. And we're here in California, so that's a real good state to look at as far as what's going on and what happens when you have a state that has decided to legalize cannabis. And in California, much like the federal government, it's also a crazy patchwork of laws and regulations. You have 3 different agencies at the state level providing licenses for various types of activities in the industry, and then they also have rules and regulations about each individual city or municipality or county that can make their own rules. They can ban it, or they can further do further regulations that are further restrictive as well before deciding to license these businesses. You can't even operate unless you have that local approval and state approval. And so it creates a lot of barriers for the end consumer. And to that end, Mr. Margolin probably has a lot he'd like to say as to how these laws and regulations are affecting the consumer.
Thank you. First of all, I can't help. Hello, am I working? First of all, I want to say how much I appreciated your presentation. It was so well spoken and so complete. There's so much confusion going on about what's happening. It's very hard to keep up with it. And as you noted, why I'm here is, in part, I'm a lawyer. I've been a defense attorney for 52 years, defending weed cases, but also another hat called NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, which I've been the director of since 1973. And our duty and our shall we say, our thrust is to represent the consumer. And so banking laws, this affects us. On-site consumption locations are terribly important to us right now. I've been talking about a lot, and you're going to pick up the ball there, right, for West Hollywood?
Yes.
And I was there the other night. It was a great event to hear how things are going on that. But see, there's an example. People can't get the money to invest in these different companies that they've got the licenses for, because legitimate people don't want to be in a market where they can't really conduct business in a way that's above board. And by the way, John Jacobin, you forgot to mention lawyers too. I know lawyers, some of them very personally, that they will not accept their money in the bank. Now that's pretty outrageous, isn't it? And how they determine that? They look at their websites, they look at this, they look at that. I mean, it's pretty outrageous what we're dealing with here. So it's like a Orwellian world we live in. But getting back to my efforts here, and what my concern is that, again, for the sake of the consumer, we have to get this straightened out. And also for the sake of the consumer, we strongly need to have on-site consumption locations, because, as you may or may not know, and if you don't know, you can read my guide, you'll know everything about what's going on. My guide to marijuana laws is free online at 420 Laws. But what you don't know is you can only smoke in a very limited location, and that would be in a residence that either you own or your friends own. And that means generally no one can smoke anywhere in the city of Los Angeles or even West Hollywood. You can't smoke in the street, you can't smoke in your apartment unless your landlord allows it. You can't smoke in your condo unless the condo committee allows it. And if you're in a Section 8, you can't even have it in your apartment. this is all got to be changed, and we have to do something in the meantime, and that is where we're talking about, and she's going to take over here, on the on-site consumption licenses, right? What's going on in West Hollywood. They're really close to it. I've been down, my practice was in West Hollywood for 37 years, and I will say I got the Trailblazer of the Year award by the City Council. You know about that? It was very exciting. Anyway, so this is something that I'm glad to see you here with. I'm glad to hear what you have to say. And again, I appreciate very much what you had to say. It was very well spoken. Thank you so much. Okay, with that, I'll give it back to the boss.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate it. And it really is a major issue that Bruce touched on, which is when you get past the crush of the licensing and the people that are so concerned with making these businesses, is you sometimes tend to forget where is a safe place for many people to be able to consume, and in many cases medicate, considering that, as Bruce mentioned, social federal funded housing and the like, if you do that, you lose your lease. And what if it really is something that could be of a benefit? And then what are they supposed to do? Go out in the middle of the street where that's illegal to consume in public? It's a major issue. And so we have someone that's at the forefront and on one of the first cities here with us today, which is great because she can pull the curtain back a little bit to help us show how cities are truly trying to work with consumers and with these businesses and with lawmakers, but how detailed and time-consuming of a process it is. And Jackie, if you could talk to that and what you've experienced in West Hollywood, we'd love to hear it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have the great honor and fortune of working for probably one of the most progressive cities in the state of California. So for us, thanks. You know, when I started working on the cannabis regulations in our city, about 2.5, 3 years ago, we were very fortunate to bring together and assemble a great group of cannabis businesses and advocates to help inform the crafting of our ordinance, because, you know, people in cities, I mean, we're not experts on cannabis, and I think part of the frustration that so many people have experienced from the state to the county to the city level and, you know, more broadly at the federal level is that you have a lot of people involved in this process that are not cannabis experts, but if they're not seeking the advice and the input from the cannabis industry to really craft the most responsible but also flexible kinds of regulations, you know, we stumble and we hit roadblocks. And I think that's part of what we're experiencing here in California, where we have 482 cities in California, and I think we were all very glad when the voters approved a legalization of cannabis, recreational cannabis, but did anyone poll all these 482 cities to find out how many of them were interested in enacting regulations? Because a lot of forecasts were made that I think were not based on reality. I mean, as you've seen, a lot of cities, I think only about a quarter of the cities in the state have active cannabis regulations. So that impacts, all of these forecasts and what's, we're seeing. The other difficulty, as I see it, and I think, I know I'll be preaching to the choir here, but all of these changes and all of these or proposals that we talk about, to me, I just see them as just nibbling around the edges, because until cannabis is descheduled, this is all just kind of window dressing to some extent, because even the banking proposals, that will help, no doubt. But, what about funding for research? We have major institutions in the state of California that could contribute greatly to educating both, patients and even recreational users and law enforcement and all the people involved in cannabis, but they cannot use, any funding that's federal, or because they receive federal funding, they're not at liberty to do that. How about, we talk about equity, but anybody here that runs a business, you can write off all your business, most of your business expenses as a legitimate legal business. As a cannabis business, you spend a great deal of money. A lot of the businesses that we're working with, they're paying wonderful wages, offering great benefits to their employees and all that, and they don't get to write off any of that. So how can someone compete? How is this a level playing field when, a legitimate business owner, is having to put out all this cash, all this capital investment to start out, and they can't even write off, the business expenses that any other legitimate business can write off. And then lastly, in our city, as excited as we are for all the businesses that we selected to receive a license, some of them are still struggling to secure a lease. Why? Because, this is seen as the, new gold rush, and, property owners, some of them legitimately, they feel they're going to put their properties on the line. They may be seized. So they're trying to protect themselves. So they're, charging 6 figures per month for, properties to lease to cannabis businesses because they're trying to protect their own investment. So all of these things, as long as cannabis remains, a scheduled substance, all of these things are going to continue to provide, represent barriers. And, we as a city, again, as progressive as we are and as excited as we are to, have a consumption lounge and more to come. And, we welcome everyone to experience cannabis in a responsible and safe environment, just like you would with a cocktail or any other thing, that we do enjoy in our city. We do, we're only one piece in the cog. We have to deal with the state agencies. We have to deal with the county agencies, the sheriff's department, the health department, the fire department, all of these agencies that all have a piece in this regulatory scheme, but all for varying reasons are a little bit apprehensive to, just take a dive in the deep end of the pool like we did in West Hollywood. I just think on the one hand, I'm very fortunate to be in a city like West Hollywood, and we, developed an ordinance that we thought was creative and flexible. We had the good fortune to work with incredible businesses and partners in this process that have guided us through it. But I sense the frustration, we sense it too, that we're trying to work with these businesses because we want them to be hugely successful. They have selected our city for a reason. They're making huge investments. They're going to hire people, create opportunities in our city, and we want them to thrive and be successful. And I think the push, I keep saying, I've said this, I think at 4 previous panels here at Digital Hollywood, that I think after the elections next year that we'll see movement in this direction. Hopefully it'll happen sooner than that, but I think the fact that we have a, general election is probably creating a little bit of a barrier in that sense, but I think after that we may see, more movement. But I think at the local level, all of you help with this process, and and I just encourage you to continue to be patient and to continue to work with us, to guide us, to inform us, to educate us, so that we can continue to craft and modify ordinances, because we can't get it right the first time. This is going to be an evolving process, and we need all of you in this process.
I couldn't agree more, Jackie. And that's actually a really big issue, is that patience is very important. We have very earnest people like Jackie at every level trying to do quite a bit. And, it's definitely something that people think that it should just be, okay, it's legal now, or in the state, why aren't we just getting our licenses? What's going on? The time for implementing and dealing with may seem right in a vacuum and what might work in reality. We're still a very young industry. And as a result of that, there's a lot of things that still need to be worked out as in trial and error as we go. And Bruce, I think that you might have some further insights.
I wanted to add something to the conversation, which I typically do when I have an opportunity, and that it's not just like having a cocktail at a bar, smoking weed. Marijuana is a sacred herb given us by the divine, okay? And people smoke it not just like a bar. Many people use it as a path to God. And people have a right to assemble and be together and talk about what they're doing with the herb, how they affects them, and also it does something special to people, all right? In a bar, they drink 3 or 4 drinks, they want to fight with each other, okay? In a cannabis event, they'll want to hug each other and be lovers together, okay? They say the husband comes home from work, has a beer, beats his wife. The husband comes home from work and smokes a joint, he makes love to her, okay?
Well, there you go.
So
let's do it. Well, you know, we've had medical cannabis in West Hollywood for about 12 years, and, you know, we've never had any problems with cannabis businesses, and yet we have other problems with some other businesses that are legal. And, I mean, it's just the reality of it. I think there's a lot of fear, and some are just completely unfounded. You know, like, I'll give you an example. So right now, because we don't have standards like we do with alcohol for what constitutes an impaired driver, right? So all they can say, it's a subjective measure. It's, you know, you're impaired. Well, how many of us see people driving while they're talking on their phone? You're impaired if you're talking on your phone, but yet, you know, that people seem to be okay with that.
Because they're stoned, that's why.
And you know, it's interesting, Jack, because you're looking at one thing, you were talking about banking, but first off, this is a very forward-thinking and socially equitable industry that is trying very hard to be at the forefront of moving the social justice meter as well. And I'm just curious what you've seen at the federal level, because I understand that, you know, there's a lot of different interests and a lot of different things that are going on. And so besides banking, what else are you seeing at the federal level in terms of efforts to further move this industry forward?
Thank you for that question. The House Judiciary Chairman, who's sort of busy with some technical issues right now with oversight, has put forward a social equity bill called the MORE Act. Normal National was very helpful in putting that bill together and supporting that, and many folks in the social justice movement and civil rights movement had a lot of impact on that bill.
What is the bill? What is it?
The MORE Act would do everything from decriminalization to expungement of records and everything in between. I believe it actually also would deschedule the drug, although I'm not certain on that.
How about reparation?
Pardon? Deschedule completely, I believe.
How about reparation? Is that in it?
I'm not clear. I haven't spent as much time on this bill. I just know that it's gotten a lot of energy on the activist side, and you know, the folks like civil rights organizations and longtime cannabis activists have really pushed this bill. And we expect it to come to the floor after some of this other stuff is done. Unfortunately, there's really not a path forward to a bill like this that really focuses on national social justice matters that can get through the current U.S. Senate. So that's the challenge, but there's a lot of energy in the House. Everyone from the Congressional Black Caucus to the Hispanic Caucus to the Democratic Caucus at large is really excited about the MORE Act and really looking forward to it coming to the floor. Now, it's an imperfect bill. It's got very little opportunity in the Senate, but it's a flag in the ground for what we need to do and what our federal government needs to do to correct some of the problems from the past.
Fantastic, and that's important. And you know, I realize we're talking directly about cannabis today, and sometimes there's a confusion about what everybody calls CBD, even though it's not directly just CBD. And so I figured I'd take a quick minute or two just to explain the difference to everybody, and then we'll open it up for questions to the floor. There is basically two components to the cannabis industry, depending on how the plant is classified. Recently, people have heard about the 2018 Farm Bill and heard that certain types of cannabis have now been descheduled and are no longer subject to the Controlled Substances Act, and that's what's known as hemp. Simply put, hemp is any plant that tests out with less than 0.3% THC, and you have to go through a specific testing structure as you're getting it planted, harvested, and then tested in the products. Now, CBD is known as cannabidiol. There are many active chemical components and cannabinoids, as they're called, in the plant. Two of the most commonly known ones are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol, or CBD. Typically speaking, THC is one that tends to give you that more euphoric feeling, that quote-unquote high, that dopamine-blocking receptors that people look for recreationally or to help as an alternative to opioid pain management. CBD also blocks pain receptors, but doesn't give you that euphoric feeling and such. And so when people are talking about CBD, The question is, where is it being derived from? Is it being derived from a cannabis plant or being done at a state licensed cannabis facility via the cannabis licensing regime, or is it being derived from hemp? If it's being derived from hemp or any other oils from hemp plants, then it's not going to be considered a controlled substance. And so that's why people are saying CBD is legal. Well, it's more legal, but it still is a patchwork protocol that's still coming to place. The FDA just put out some new regulations that are still just being looked at right now. I mean, it's still not entirely believed to be safe for human consumption yet, and there still is certain rules that are supposed to come from each of the U.S. Agricultural Department and how that mixes and matches with the state's hemp programs and such like that. And so because of that, it's not as open or easy to do. You can't just like basically just legally go out and just start selling CBD. So it's something to look at, but it's also something that's difficult to regulate and watch because of limited resources. So it's important to know when you hear someone saying CBD is legal now, just the first question is, well, is it really? Where's it coming from? And so with that, we've got the two differences, and so there's two different ways to business now and ways to consumption. One is through the legal cannabis business by state, and the other is through the hemp industry as a component of hemp. And so there's different avenues and opportunities for each. I always joke that marijuana used to be considered a gateway drug, and in many senses it's now a gateway business. And so, haha. Anyway, we'd like to open it up to the floor for questions, and if anybody has any, I'd love to hear them. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. First, thanks for doing this. Two questions. What do you see as the biggest challenge for ancillary non-plant touching businesses? And then second question is, and it's you're going to get this in every panel, what's your prediction on federal legality?
Well, why don't we, does either Bruce or Jackie want to talk about ancillary, or would you like me to? I'm going to save the federal question for Jack.
So ancillary non-cannabis products being sold, and the city of West Hollywood has been working with the BCC and with the state legislation to craft a bill that would allow that. I mean, the easiest path to it would have been to reintroduce the language that was eliminated that allowed for non-cannabis products. I mean, it was just those few little words that basically, and it just said that non-cannabis products could be available provided that, you know, they're in compliance with local and state regulations. So that's where we thought when we crafted our ordinance, where we, you know, would have a consumption lounge that would allow food to be served, to allow for that, and then that information, those words were removed from the legislation. I mean, I think we're getting there. I mean, we're hoping that, you know, probably by early next year, that we will continue to work at the state level to reintroduce a bill that they can support, or to continue to work with the BCC to get the kind of language that they can work with within their, you know, current regulatory scheme, because I think it's really important. I mean, we want to be able to see, you know, these consumption lounges and these businesses to be treated in the same way that when we think of a bar, you know, people go to a bar and they don't just drink, they can consume food, they can, you know, have other products that, I mean, and the way that the legislation is written right now, you can't even sell a bottle of water. So we think that it's just kind of an unintended consequence of some changes that were made to the legislation, or, you know, the current regulations, and I think we are working towards that, at least, you know, with the businesses in West Hollywood that have been really instrumental in providing assistance to us and helping us craft something that the state can adopt. We're remaining positive and optimistic that, you know, early next year we can get something on the books. The federal level, I told you, I think after the elections next year, I'm going to remain optimistic about that too. I mean, I think there is a lot of momentum, and I think, you know, as you see more and more states pass legalization of cannabis, I think the tide will begin to turn.
Yeah, and so for people know, ancillary is non-plant touching businesses. And essentially, I think the two biggest challenges are stigma and banking. And because there's a federal stigma still, because it's illegal, a lot of major businesses that could be providing a lot of services, even just major food distributors who are helping to provide like major, all this all the components necessary to properly infuse foods and to do their cooking and baking, they may not want to, and you can't get those distribution networks because of what it might mean to their bottom line. And similarly, even though they're not directly involved, if a bank finds out they're doing business with cannabis businesses, it endangers their whole business bank account.
Yeah,
and those
Brian,
are the two big ones.
That's a great point. Well, I mentioned solar earlier. It's because I talked to a banking trade association. One of their members cut off one of their longtime solar customers because the solar client sold to a cannabis business. And we have those types of challenges, which is really important. And this goes from everyone. My brother's in construction, right? His bank could cut him off because he can't go in there with the $12,000 in cash and say, hey, I just did a concrete pour job and this is how I got paid. Like, that's just not acceptable to the bank, and he would have fear of getting cut off. I agree with Jackie. The next election will be very important on the federal timeline. I think the banking bill in particular could be done potentially by the end of 2020. So probably after the election, but before the new Congress is seated. I think there is a lot of momentum there. In terms of full descheduling, I'm guessing we're still in a 5-year window. I think Mexico legalizing or moving to legalize is going to put even more pressure on us because we're sandwiched now between Canada and Mexico. And we're losing ground, and America, instead of being a leader, is being a follower, and we're losing opportunities.
And that's not America.
There's one answer to all this. Smoke more weed. That's what they got to do. Everybody's got to smoke more weed. And
All right, we have time for one more question in the back.
And the billboards. You know, I know that dispensaries can't be within a certain amount of feet around schools, etc. But, you know, I've got nieces who can now read. And some of these billboards, they're just so blatant. And I don't know if anybody else has, like, brought up concerns about how these businesses, while legal, can actually advertise in a more, I don't know, subtle way. Because we don't have cigarettes advertising. So the question is, how can
It's a good question, and really it's early on. I mentioned earlier about how it's still an evolving industry and the regulations are still changing. We have some regulations already about advertising, including that it's supposed to be somehow provable that over 71% of the audience is going to be over 21 years of age. There's also rules for, in each direction, how visible it is from schools within a certain number of feet and everything like that here in Los Angeles. The Lanham Act for advertising also has some applications to it, similar to what they do for alcohol. It's one thing to have those rules, it's another thing to have the resources to enforce those rules and to see how those are working out. But I can tell you that the state and the city of Los Angeles are dealing with this and do have laws on the books. It's just a matter of what's the priority today. And so it's something that's evolving still. And, you know, Bruce, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just
besides smoke weed every day?
it's an honor to be here. I love the guests that are sitting next to me. They brought us way up from the
Wonderful.
in information. Thank
Yeah, well,
you,
we
guys.
really appreciate
I
all
loved you
three of
guys.
you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks everybody for listening. We appreciate the time, and thank you.
Pleasure.